Okay. Yeah. All right. Great. Shall we? All right. Yeah. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Fred Kagan. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Critical Threats Project here at AEI. And I'm joined on this panel by my colleague at AEI, Dan Blumenthal, also a senior fellow, as well as Bonnie Lin, senior fellow and director of the China Power Project at CSIS, and Kim Kagan, the founder and president of the Institute for the Study of War. We're here today to talk with you about a report that is the product of more than a year's worth of research effort conducted jointly by ISW and AEI as part of what we're calling our Coalition Alternative Strategies for Coalition Defense of Taiwan project. And this is a project, as I said, that started quite some time ago now. We've been working on it quite hard, and the fruits are now available online, and we'll be talking with you about that briefly. I want to emphasize that this report itself has been in preparation for many months, and in fact has been done for effectively, the work has been done. We've been in production for some time. And it was prepared, in fact, before we knew what the outcome of the Taiwanese election was going to be, and is not tied. The timing is coincidental with the inauguration, because we don't think that that's actually really the issue. We think that we have examined a way that the Chinese can potentially gain their objectives in Taiwan without having to invade. Want to emphasize, though, that there is a second phase of this project, which we will be rolling into now, which is examining the risks, dangers, and appropriate responses to the threat of a Chinese invasion. We don't discount that threat at all, and the purpose of this project, purpose of this report, is not in any way to argue that we don't need to worry about PRC invasion, that that's not a concern, that they won't do that, or any such thing. The purpose of this is to highlight an additional danger that we see and potentially an additional pathway by which the PRC could seek to gain its objectives over Taiwan. The methodology that we have used is a modified version of a methodology that Kim and I have actually been employing for 18 years now. It dates back to the effort that we were both involved in that ended up recommending the surge of U.S. forces in Iraq. And it is a modification of the military decision-making process that the U.S. Military uses to formulate campaign plans. And that's a very rigorous process. I can talk more about what exactly goes into that. But fundamentally, it's a process that in a very rigorous and detailed fashion identifies the objectives of the opposing forces, identifies the resources and capabilities that are available to them or that might be available to them, studies their past practices and past patterns of behavior, and then determines seeks to identify the key centers of gravity, the things that an adversary would most advantageously attack, the things that you as friendly forces must most assiduously defend in order to achieve your objectives. And from that, we move on to develop alternative possible courses of action that one might take in order to achieve a set of objectives. Our planning exercise here focused on courses of action that the Chinese might pursue, seeking to gain control of Taiwan. In previous exercises, we focused on courses of action the U.S. might pursue to achieve its own objectives. But the methodology is the same either way. And so that methodology has led us to identify two critical centers of gravity that were most apposite in our judgment to this particular course of action. And I should emphasize that as we move into the next phase, centers of gravity analysis will be adjusted to take account of the fact that there are different centers of gravity when you're looking at a purely military or primarily military operation as compared with a non-war or short of war option. So centers of gravity that we are focusing on here, I will leave to Dan to describe and talk about how we see potentially the PRC formulating a course of action and a campaign to attack those centers of gravity successfully and achieve its aims through a short of war coercion effort. Dan.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. One thing.
Yeah.
We will be taking questions by email. There will be an email address posted. This is because we're live casting and we want to be able to integrate questions from the online audience. Please feel free to send your questions as we're presenting to the email that will be on the screen. If you don't have access to a device or are unable to do that, flag someone down and we will help you with that. Sorry, Dan.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. So first, to acknowledge that staff at that table of ISW and AEI did so much of the work. We have a team of open source intelligence linguists from ISW and excellent Chinese speakers who are on the team, research team at AEI as well. And really their job with the guidance of Fred and myself was to put themselves, as Fred said, in the shoes and in the mind of PRC, PLA planners with the job of, your task is to take Taiwan without invading and occupying it. And, we think that it's important in the current debate, to provide a corrective to get people thinking about, again, something Kim will talk about a little bit later, but what is it that we're deterring and what is it that we're dissuading? If we actually deter an invasion, we probably aren't reaching all of our political objectives. We're not, in fact. Also, what is actually going on a daily basis, across the Taiwan Strait? It's not a static situation. On a daily basis, there's political warfare, there's kinetic demonstrations of force for cognitive and psychological effects. So, we went through the process of identifying what centers of gravity, if we were CCP planners, we would attack, what specific activities over the course of 4 years would constitute our campaign plan, our coercive short of war campaign plan, what specific mechanisms would we use, which is often missing in the literature on war games. How do you translate military, or in this case, political, military, economic victory into a sustainable political outcome if you're the CCP? How do you get to unification and persuade everybody that it's over, right? So that was very important for us as well, and we came up with a mechanism that's in the report to do that. Centers of gravity aren't going to surprise people who follow U.S. and Taiwan. The PRC would have to attack the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. That's the most important center of gravity. The second really important center of gravity, there are others, and I'm not going to give out, I don't want you to read the reports, I'm not going to give you all of them. But, and there's no cliff notes either. You have to go through all 100 pages and the appendix, which, by the way, identifies for the first time that I've seen every player from China that would be involved in such a campaign by name as well. So for our friends from the Chinese embassy that might be here or might be watching, if we got it wrong, please correct us. Maybe we got a name wrong or something like that. But the other center of gravity is often just missed, which is Taiwan's a young democracy, and the ability of a young democracy to function and to protect its people is a center of gravity. It's a center of gravity in the United States. I mean, quite frankly, if you think that countries are not susceptible to political or warfare or information warfare, then you haven't been watching Russian political warfare against the United States over the past 8 years that almost caused a rupture with NATO. So we're quite susceptible to political warfare and information warfare too. Those are the two main centers of gravity, and so we designed the campaign to attack those. There are others. And the real meat of this report, which starts on page 29? 29, yeah, I'm blind, so I'm like, okay. It really goes through graphically all the activities that the Chinese would engage in to attack these centers of gravity. So very specific theories of victory too. So everything from what we actually think is coming, and we actually did predict that the Chinese would start to operate in the waters around Taiwan the way they're operating right now, because it was just obvious to us that after you take away air sovereignty, you start taking away maritime sovereignty as well. So everything from the effects of a blockade without doing a full blockade. So a shipping inspections regime is one of the main activities, and we believe the PRC is actually planning for this now. So they're setting the legal argument and justification that they can inspect anything they want in the Taiwan Strait by saying, hey, it's domestic waters. We can't let contraband and WMD and all these other things. So imagine if they had a shipping inspections regime, they were deterred from our point of view from doing a blockade, but they're doing the shipping inspections regime. We're caught flat-footed, as we were in the South China Sea. For anyone who doubts the Chinese ability to do these kinds of campaigns, just look at the South China Sea, which is essentially Chinese territory right now. A shipping inspections regime which has the same economic and political effects without actually doing the blockade is one of the main activities. And we go through, we call them pulses. People would think of them as phases in a normal war game, for 4 years. So pulse 1, pulse 2, pulse 3, pulse 4. There has to be, for this to work, there has to be a lot of activities coming at the Taiwan government at the same time. When you talk to the Taiwan government, they will use the term cognitive warfare. We are under attack all the time with cognitive warfare. What they mean, of course, is the Chinese are using these air incursions, maritime incursions, cyber incursions, and so forth, and then they're manipulating the media to exaggerate how much effect these things are having, and creating, as President Tsai says, mental disturbances in the minds of the Taiwan people. The idea is to create a sense of siege and hopelessness, and that's what the PRC is actually doing. Around Taiwan, they're constantly circumnavigating or present on the East Coast now. You over the last few years, you kind of feel like China's just there, and it's constricting the way policy is made both in Washington and Taipei now. So imagine if those activities were ramped up and other activities were added, including economic boycotts, information campaigns targeting the United States to get the same lovely kind of debates about Taiwan that we've been having about Ukraine. So all of that is very possible in the U.S. political arena. So we target we Chinese target the U.S. midterm elections, for example, and say this would be a great time to talk about how Taiwan is not doing enough to defend itself. There's no invasion coming anyway, so we shouldn't get involved. What would we do anyway? These are economic boycotts, and people are very dismissive of gray zone threats today, so that Chinese can learn a lot from that today. As activities ramp up, we see things like more kinetic action. So, this whole kind of business of China wants to win without fighting is a little bit exaggerated. It's good for business books and so forth, how I'm going to conquer this industry without fighting. It's not exactly right if you really look at the Chinese literature. It's win with the less fighting as possible, and position yourself first before you engage in kinetic activity, such that the kinetic activity has a better chance of succeeding. So we steeped ourselves in the Chinese strategic literature as well to make this consistent with the Chinese strategic literature. So there are kinetic attacks in our pulses, very specific ones on offshore islands. There are problems that the Chinese cause in the rest of Indo-PACOM, such that you're creating cognitive overload, perception overload, and this is in Chinese writings, Chinese PLA writings, overload, not only in the Taiwan government, which all of a sudden has to deal with all these different crises, manifold crises, but in the US, Indo-PACOM has to respond to Solomon Island crises, North Korea crises, and the point is to paralyze the system. Something the Chinese write about a lot, systems paralysis. And so we really thought through how you can do that. We get then to ramped up activities, complete economic boycotts of Taiwan, physical and cyber destruction of critical infrastructure. So the feeling of being subverted, which is the CCP birthright and inheritance. I mean, that's how they won the Civil War in the first place, right? This feeling of being subverted in Taiwan, we wanted to create that feeling that you're infiltrated, you're subverted. If you can create that effect on Taiwan, then your allies don't want to do very much with you either, right? So if they think you're infiltrated, they are deterred from acting with you because they don't want to be infiltrated either. So things like the critical infrastructure is really important, and that gets to some of the recommendations we have as well, which are very specific about how to to be more resilient on critical infrastructure. And then we get to, okay, after 4 years of this, so it's as much pain infliction on Taiwan as you can get away with while convincing the United States not to get involved, right? That's the sort of, if you boil it down, how much pain can you inflict on Taiwan without setting off US involvement, right? Both because you've convinced the United States there's nothing they can do, you've convinced the United States that Taiwan's in chaos, and so forth. But then you have to get to an actual political outcome if you're China, right? And so what's the political outcome? Well, you need a peace candidate, right? And that's not, for those who really know Taiwan, know that that's not impossible. I mean, there's a serious peace camp, not unification camp. I mean, we're not saying in any way that Taiwan would voluntarily choose unification. But after 4 years of pain without anybody coming to your aid, the peace camp probably grows, right? And so how do you get to a peace camp? How do you get to a peace candidate? We go through that in our report. You can either do that through electoral means, or you can manipulate the electoral and political process. We researched legislative, the sort of laws and so forth, and how you manipulate the political process such that you can also get to a peace candidate another way. And then, the denouement of this is a peace mechanism, which the Chinese say, are you ready for peace, after all this? And let's just talk about peace. Let's start a commission that talks about peace. Let's have 2 Taiwanese or 3 Taiwanese and 3 Chinese, and we'll talk about peace, which of course, sort of like Hong Kong style, is the Trojan horse for eventually getting rid of Taiwan autonomy and relations with the United States. So the pain infliction has to be high enough that enough people want peace. The isolation, the other point is, Taiwan is sui generis in international politics. So for people who say this can't work, they don't understand Taiwan very well. So because Taiwan has all the attributes and operates like a nation state, but isn't recognized by anybody, they're particularly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Right, so one of our recommendations, and I'm pushing the administration to do this because I think they'll have to, is to announce, more in sorrow than in anger, that Taiwan actually has maritime rights that are being violated. Just because we don't recognize them as a nation, that doesn't take away their maritime rights, right? And it's very important that we do that. It's very important that the international community does that. There's some very more specific recommendations in terms of a Taiwan merchant marine and how the Taiwan Coast Guard should operate and so on and so forth. But it's very important that we don't let China redefine the legalities around the Taiwan Strait, and that's what they're doing, because they're not just going to define it for academic reasons, they're going to define it as a basis for action. So key recommendation there. We have a whole set of other very specific recommendations on how you defeat coercion. I'll just mention one and then stop talking. So the answer to some of the incursions that are ongoing now, for example, is not a symmetrical military response. There is no way that Taiwan and the United States could follow every Chinese jet, or track every Chinese task force that's going around The answer is political asymmetry, right? So hit China with something to get them to stop that they actually care about. So they want to mess with Taiwan's ADIZ and flight paths. Let's increase civil aviation cooperation with the rest of the world in Taiwan. That's the cost China has to pay for what they're doing right now. Let's get Taiwan into a regional air defense architecture as the response. So we have to think asymmetrically, politically. I hate the word asymmetric in so many ways because it's used and abused and no one knows what it means when it comes to the defense of Taiwan. But what I mean here is very specifically, don't answer them, plane by plane and ship by ship on their gray zone harassment and intimidation. Answer them by making them pay a political cost for that gray zone harassment. And in my experience, that's what China responds to the most. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say. Read the report, all 100 pages in the appendix, and look forward to the next reports coming out in the next year. But over to Bonnie, I think, right? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and of course, thank you, Fred. Really great to be here at AEI, and of course, congratulations to an excellent report between AEI and the Institute for Study of War. I just want to start off my comments by mentioning how important this study is, particularly right now. If you talk to folks about where you assess China is this year on using large-scale military force against Taiwan, I think there's probably a general consensus that China is relatively preoccupied with either domestic economic issues or other issues, that Taiwan is not at the top of Xi Jinping's list in terms of using major large-scale military force. Sometimes that conversation ends there and we end with China is deterred. But I think if you look at the political realities on the ground and what Taiwan faces on a daily basis, you're seeing that China continues to escalate coercion against Taiwan. So what this piece, what this excellent report does is fills in the gap of really listing all the different ways that China could escalate gray zone coercion, but also offering a path that China could potentially achieve unification or goals similar or close to unification without an invasion. And I think that's currently, to be honest, quite missing in the literature. So that's why the study is so valuable. And I would note that it's something that, from my understanding, we need to pay more attention to because if DC is way too focused on just the invasion scenario and to some extent also a bit more focused on the blockade scenario, but not enough on the gray zone side. From my perspective, I think China wants all options on the table. China wants to be able to invade, wants to be able to blockade, but also wants the option of being able to unify with Taiwan without having to engage in the very large-scale military options. And that's where this report comes in and offering a large range of potential options. So I think the major strength of the report is, as Dan mentioned, the very specifics in the report. I haven't seen another report with such a rich menu of options. And as I think Dan and Fred mentioned, that what they are proposing isn't exactly, they're not predicting that China is going to take this action in 2026, 2027, but what they're proposing is a combination of different pressure tactics or activities that China could put together. So when I look at the different pulses and the different activities, I don't think, for example, China's going to definitely do this in 2027, but I look at all the different activities and I think maybe China could engage in this combination, or it could be a different combination across the different activities, but it's incredibly valuable to have that in one place, a long list of activities in one place. And I would also give credit to the authors of the report in that they not only came up with this long list of activities, but also, I think it's in the appendix or somewhere in the long report, they documented evidence of China engaging in similar activities in the past to justify why they came up with these future activities that build on similar activities in the past. And as Dan mentioned, what is really rich about the list of activities and gray zone tactics that they highlight is that these activities aren't just targeting Type A, right? Some are meant to divide up Taiwan as a society. Some are meant to target the main island of Taiwan. Others are meant to target offshore islands. The instrument that China uses isn't just the PLA, it's a cross-dime. So I think it's incredibly rich, and I would commend folks, if you haven't read the report, even if you don't have time to read through everything, at least look at the tables that have the different pulses, activities, because that by itself is very, very rich. Now, in terms of areas where I think this report opens up more venue for research that we can all build on, I think there are a couple of areas. So what really struck me about this report early on was that it postulated that it's possible for China potentially to get close to unification or achieve unification using just coercion in 4 years, by 2028. My going in assumption before reading this report was if China had to use pressure tactics short of a major military operation, that would be a much longer timeline for China to achieve unification with Taiwan. But I think they present an interesting case that we need to study a little bit more, the possibility that coercion tactics may not necessarily require a really long timeline for unification, but maybe China could achieve that in a shorter period. I would also say that the other thing that struck me from this report is the focus is on coercion, but there are also mentions of carrots that China could offer, carrots which have a coercive use. And the report highlights a number of ways in which China could engage with the United States or our allies and partners to buy time or to basically throw us or our allies and partners off of different, to basically discourage us from engaging in activities to further compete with China. And I think I did not see, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see those carrots being offered to the Taiwan people or to those on Taiwan. And I think that's a huge part of China's strategy, not only the sticks that are used against everyone, but also the carrots that are used against everyone. And I would offer that maybe for later research, it would be interesting to see to what extent does China use carrots to help to divide Taiwan society just as effectively as their use of coercive pressure. I also wanted to commend the report for discussion of the ways in China would leverage some of its regional allies and partners. I think multiple parts in the report mentioned potentially North Korea taking activity. I also saw in the report China working with regional allies to engage in various types of maritime operations. And I think that's particularly important today and very timely given that Putin is in Beijing now. And I think it's very realistic as we look forward that we will see China engaging in more activities with its close friends to put pressure on Taiwan, or at least create the impression in the United States and elsewhere that it has these friends that China could draw upon in a coercion scenario, but also in a crisis and conflict scenario. I think, though, if China continues to strengthen these activities, and again, I know that you didn't want to create a 500-page report. There's probably a lot more that China could be doing with its friends and partners in this space. Another point I wanted to mention, which I think we could build on a little bit more or perhaps expand, is what you were mentioning earlier, Dan, in terms of I think you called it the peace framework. And how the peace camp and how that could be, how Chinese pressure on Taiwan over time could build a larger contingency or support within Taiwan for that peace camp. And part of what you described there included that the KMT would be part of this peace camp. I think as you look at the peace camp and sort of those efforts and how close that brings Taiwan to unification, I think it might buy time for China to perhaps really dial down pressure, but I don't think that may necessarily mean that it's that much closer to unification. And here, I don't want to represent our KMT friends, but I think even if you look at the direction of where the KMT is headed, depending on how the pressure is received within Taiwan, you could also see elements of the KMT that take on a different position than where they are now, and could be less receptive to engaging with the Chinese. So we have to also think through the scenario that more Chinese pressure on Taiwan, yes, it could divide Taiwan, but it also could have an effect of creating more divisions within already existing political parties within Taiwan. I wanted to also perhaps ask you to expand on some of the recommendations which I thought were quite important. The one recommendation that you had was expand the Taiwan Relations Act application to coercion scenarios. I guess the question I had, and you talked a little bit about this, was in your opening statement, was how exactly would we do this? And you mentioned perhaps engaging in political or asymmetric activities, because I think typically when this is mentioned, the first response from the audience or from outside folks is we can't respond tit for tat. Right, so if we do expand the TRA's application to the coercion scenario, it would be very important to be able to identify a number of very specific asymmetries that we can draw on, and make it clear that even in the expansion of the TRA to respond to Taiwan coercion scenarios, we're not expecting the United States to be in the lead in all of these. Right, we're not expecting the United States to bear the larger majority of the costs, but it would be perhaps shared costs and bring in a larger coalition to share those costs. I think. Those were all my comments, but overall, I highly recommend this report. I think it really helps move the ball forward, and I really look forward to additional research from Fred and Dan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Dan, Fred, and team for the wonderful work on this report. I want to take a step back and really just talk about why it is so important for us to consider the campaigns short of war that our competitors, enemies, and adversaries are waging, because I think that they have profound consequences for United States strategy and United States preparedness today. The United States tends to think that it is incredibly vital and indeed important that its military have strength to deter war. And of course, that is true. Our military should be strong, and deterring wars with adversaries or with competitors is an important component of US strategy. But it is also important to recognize that deterring a war does not actually in itself secure the objectives of the United States. In other words, when our national security strategies and our defense strategies state that the goal of our military is to deter war, we forget that our enemies and adversaries can use a suite of actions, instruments, and policy means short of war actually to obtain and attain their policy objectives. And that it is equally important to be able to contest the ways in which our enemies, adversaries, and competitors seek to gain objectives such as what they would call unification. Or reunification, we need to contest that very, very much, and we cannot allow deterrence itself to overwhelm the strategic conversation that we're having about making sure that our enemies and adversaries don't actually just basically walk into the end zone with a ball. And that is, I think, truly important. Secondly, it's common in our military to think that when we plan for a full-scale war and when we are preparing to defend an area, allies or partners around the world, that we have actually, by thinking of this very complicated, highly kinetic, highly contested activity, that we are in some way preparing for the lower grade campaigns of coercion, political warfare, information warfare, and so forth. And that is not the case. We have to be ready at different parts of the spectrum of the contest with our adversaries, enemies, and competitors. And we can't imagine that having everything that we need to persuade the the CCP that it is unwise actually to use military force to take Taiwan will actually keep it or prevent it from using these cognitive and political and informational war tools. We need actually to plan for both. And we need to develop the toolkit for these short of war scenarios. And we need to recognize that these coercive activities that our enemies and adversaries engage in actually set the path-dependent conditions on which a later war may be fought. And we have seen that in Russia's engagement in Ukraine prior to 2014 and then prior to 2022. And the work of the team actually to identify the ways that the CCP is actually pressing on some of these coercive levers right now actually makes it all the more important to think about how we respond to those levers and to the campaigns that our enemies design. That brings me to campaigns. Our enemies and adversaries design campaigns that aim to deprive us of the ability to think and act and to make it harder and harder for us to make decisions. That is, I think, the true definition of cognitive war. And it's not simply information, it's not simply politics. One can overwhelm policymakers, body politics, and different actors with these pulses of activity that keep political leaders from focusing on and pursuing their positive priorities. What I think we need to get better at doing writ large is understanding when this kind of campaign is underway by our enemies and adversaries. The first step is recognize the campaign, that these things that we generally perceive as one-off activities are actually often coordinated in time and space to generate particular effects. And that was true, again, of Russia prior to both invasions of Ukraine, and it is true likewise of China. Secondly, after we recognize that campaign, we actually need to contest that campaign, and very importantly, contest the predicates that the enemy or adversary wants to set. And challenging the frameworks up front that will underpin the enemy's or adversary's discourse, essential. And we can see how important that is in a case like Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, and Russia's use of its own informational, cognitive, and political warfare tools to normalize the idea that somehow Crimea is legally different from the rest of Ukraine and properly in Russia's sphere of influence, and therefore in no way to be returned to Ukraine as part of its sovereign territory at the end of the current conflict. We have to contest these predicates when they arise, and these predicates that the Russians have put out started well before 2014. Contest now. And then lastly, we need to create resilience inside ourselves and inside our allies, adversaries, and partners in order to have them think about how to use and balance their political tools and instruments to reduce the strain of the cognitive war that our enemies and adversaries are imposing, and to create greater social, political, and military resistance to their attacks. That, I think, is the common framework that links what is happening in Taiwan and Asia Pacific writ large with what is happening in Ukraine and the rest of the world.
Fantastic. A reminder, please submit questions to the email that is on the screen. And we'll be happy to take those. Dan, do you want to respond to any of what either Kim or Bonnie has said?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I hope I've read this report so many times, but I hope we stayed away from labeling any particular party. Both Fred's disclaimer at the beginning, we were doing this sort of without knowing who was going to win the elections and so on, and the KMT is certainly thought of as more of a peace camp, but I don't think we named them as such. And I take your point completely that's a much more complicated picture. I think a peace camp exists, which is understandable already, not necessarily KMT only, just because for all sorts of reasons, and the Chinese have some room to play with that peace camp already, because sometimes in the United States, when we say to Taiwan, well, you should really be prepared to defend yourself like the Ukrainians did, right? And they're looking at Ukraine and saying, they're very brave, but gosh, that's a lot of destruction and conflict, and we're isolated, on this island over here. So that's not there'll be people naturally in Taiwan who say that's not a great outcome. Peace seems better. And that's why also, 60%, a big reason why 60% of the population voted against the current party in some respects, because they view them as, quote, too provocative. So China has a lot of room to play in the political arena in Taiwan and manipulate messages. Obviously the message that comes out now in Taiwan is the United States is unreliable. The United States will get Taiwan, into a war for their purposes. And that resonates. I mean, you say it enough and it resonates. It's a constant information, relentless information campaign. And I think, really, I would be not doing my job if I didn't help people understand that. That's a daily fight in Taiwan, is to fight off these anti-American messages too that are getting quite resonant. So, one of the reasons we think that this can work and that this kind of campaign could work, and that China may not need to take the high risk of starting, a massive war in the Western Pacific, is because there's still room to manipulate politics and the center. I mean, I use the word center of gravity a lot, but not for the purposes of this campaign plan. Just for purposes of U.S.-China-Taiwan relations, the center of gravity is politics on Taiwan, right? That's it. That's the core of the apple. So I take your point, and I think the hardest thing to do, actually, the hardest part of this planning exercise was what you pointed out, which is how do you get agreement from a Taiwan side that there is no hope except for peace, right? And how does China then use that peace camp, that peace mechanism, then as the Trojan horse? That's the hardest thing to think through. But by the way, an invasion and occupation of Taiwan, you'd also need to think through that too, because you have to terminate the war. So you have to have some mechanism in place that says it's over, stop resisting, right? And that's missing from a lot of the discussion about invasion scenarios as well. And then your point about carrots, I think, is important too. So and obviously right now what the CCP is doing is they're inviting the opposition party to come to China and get the carrots, and they've made their decision about the ruling party, that they can't deal with the ruling party. So that's a big part of it. And also, who does China empower by giving those carrots is a game that they're playing as well. I think it's important for people who are looking at this just from the defense analysis lens. We put out this tracker, the ISW team and the AI team, but the ISW team does the bulk of it. Put out this weekly tracker that tracks Chinese activities in political manipulation and malign influence across the Taiwan Strait. There is so much activity that goes on a weekly basis. The idea that China would just wake up one day and decide, we're going to invade, I'm being a little bit flip about, the other side of this argument, but there is so much activity, that Xi directs in his effort at peaceful reunification. All of that he'd have to say that none of this is working anymore, which he's not. I mean, he's obviously ramping up these activities. So we're tracking that very closely, also as signs that he's given up on the peaceful reunification part of his policy.
So we already have some great questions coming in, and I will come to those in a moment. Please send me more. I think I would like to emphasize, having watched Ukraine go through a version of this for many years, and looking at the situation in Taiwan and having had the privilege of engaging with some of our Taiwanese colleagues, to say Taiwan obviously has a number of huge disadvantages in this effort, which don't require further elucidation here. But it does have an important advantage, which is the Taiwanese recognize that this is going on. And that is the first step, actually, to, as all of my colleagues have said, and as the report says, that is actually the first step toward being able to resist it. And they are ahead of the Ukrainians in some respects in that regard, ahead of where the Ukrainians were before the 2022 invasion, and certainly ahead of where they were before 2014, in terms of recognizing that this is going on. Now, recognizing that it's going on is not tantamount to defeating it. And the fact that it is going on every day gives the PRC an advantage as well, because the PRC is able to test things out in real life, in real time, and see how they work and refine and have a sort of an offense-defense cycle in this cognitive warfare campaign, not dissimilar from the offense-defense cycle that we see going on in the kinetic war in Ukraine right now. Of course, we could also benefit from that by observing what works and what doesn't. One of the aspects of the campaign that we posit here, though, is that although you can recognize that you are the victim of a cognitive warfare campaign, you may not recognize all of its components. And in fact, a well-designed cognitive warfare campaign will try to prevent you from recognizing all of the components of that campaign. And so lots of things will go on that are meant to seem exogenous to that campaign, but are actually central parts of it. And that's one of the things that we need to be very alive to as we think about responding to this. But let me get to the great questions that we have. So, Dan, this is for us. The study has appropriately focused, I'm sorry, that's also a good question, but I'm not, one sec. How would we respond to the counter arguments that this campaign wouldn't work when we have seen China do so much of this already?
Well, so first I'd say that we've seen China do some of this already, but to Fred's point, they haven't done this already, which is this coordinated 4-year, campaign that is of an, I don't want to say an order of magnitude, but it probably is an order of magnitude higher in its pressure than what we've seen already. So it's not. It's hard to buy the argument that it won't work when it hasn't been tried, and certainly not tried in the way that we think it can be tried. So I think we designed it in such a way to say, yes, these are activities that the Chinese have engaged in other places, successfully in the South China Sea, less successfully in the East China Sea, in other places in the Taiwan Strait itself, but not at this level of intensity, not at this level of coordination, not at this level where it's also targeting Washington. And by the way, I should mention that, that to your point that, so Taipei may recognize that this is going on to a certain degree. Washington doesn't really recognize that this is going on. So, for example, they have officially bought the argument that William Lai is some kind of provocateur, right? Like, to your point about buying, this argument about Crimea, we've officially bought this argument that Lai is substantially different than President Tsai, right? There's no evidence for that. Everything he's saying is exactly in line with what she says, all his formulations. But Washington officially is buying the argument that that's a Chinese, you can source that to Chinese propaganda, right? So I don't think, I think this campaign is ongoing. And Washington is very susceptible to it. It doesn't realize, let's go back to the Pelosi visit, right? We were repeating Chinese threats as if they were credible, that the third in line to the United States presidency was going to be assassinated. Shot down. Like, we took that seriously, and had the White House try to get her not to go, right? If that's not a successful cognitive, psychological campaign, I don't know what is, right? Because that's just not credible, and it's part of a psychological campaign. Credible people were repeating it, but we're still not aware in Washington. This is why I think it really could work. We're still not aware in Washington that the Chinese engage in this political warfare game, with us on Taiwan in particular, on a daily basis.
So I have two questions here. I'm actually gonna pair them, even though they seem very dissimilar, because I actually think one is part of the answer to the other. The first one is, the study has appropriately focused on the defense of Taiwan. Are there opportunities to play offense and take things to China, like more active and overt coordination to expose Chinese information operations? And a question that for me is paired is, how do or should lessons learned from the war in Ukraine impact our thinking about this potential conflict? How do I get there? Because we actually experimented with this in the war, in the lead up to the full-scale invasion in 2022, when the United States government actually leaned into the pre-bunking campaign. This has now been so many years ago and so much has happened, most people have probably forgotten about that. But the US government actively leaned into an effort to declassify intelligence that it had about information operations that the Russians were preparing to run before the Russians ran them. In many cases, they were actually just straightforward information operations. In other cases, I think they were actual physical provocations that the Russians had been planning to conduct and then exploit informationally. In some cases, I think the Russians actually did go ahead and conduct the kinetic activity, but by the time they had done that, the White House had already basically destroyed the informational effect of that. It's hard to underestimate how important that pre-bunking campaign was, because the Russians had actually built out a holistic and extremely well thought through information operation, cognitive warfare campaign to persuade the world that the Ukrainians had provoked the war and that the Russians had been drawn into the war to defend the innocent people of a Russian-occupied Donbass against Ukrainian chemical weapons attacks and a whole bunch of other crazy nonsensical stuff. But the Russians had worked out a whole campaign to persuade everybody that that was what was going to go on. And if that campaign had been allowed to operate without contest or simply with the usual reactive defensive responses, I do not think that we would have seen the degree of unanimity against the Russian invasion and support for Ukraine's defense of itself that we did see on February 24th and 25th and 26th and for many, many months after that. That was an example of a very successful, you can say, offensive information operation to a preemptive, really, information operation. I think it's unfortunate, frankly, that the White House has stopped doing that, because the Russians, one of the things that's gone on is the Russians have actually become much more effective now with their own information operations, in part because we've stopped doing this. But I do think that that's something that we could actually do and should do to address some of this problem, because the more that you can say up front, hey, guess what? The Chinese are about to run an information operation that's going to be this. When they actually do it, you can say, look at that. We said that, so it's an information operation. But it's not a one and done. That's something that you really have to sustain over the long term. Those are my quick thoughts about those questions. Would you like to offer anything?
Do you have anything on the offense part, or I have some thoughts, but you go
but I wanted to add to the earlier question that, Dan, you were asking about where folks were saying that some of the options you presented, China has already done. I was actually going to say that you presented, of course, you're not trying to write like a 1,000-page report, right? So you presented the high-level ideas of different activities that China could do, but a lot of follow-on research can then unpack what exactly that means. So, for example, in the opening, you referenced the shipping inspection operations regime, right? So we've been conducting parallel work at CSIS, which now I see can build very neatly with yours. And just looking at how China can conduct a quarantine of Taiwan, we're postulating 2 different ways to do that. And that by itself is like pages of reports. So like each activity that you've outlined can actually be unpacked to be much more specific and much more expansive than what you have in the report. So I think when folks look at just, just the couple of lines that you have in there, but of course you couldn't elaborate on everything. I think they shouldn't be viewed as just continuing what's already there, but there's a lot of room for China to actually expand on all the range of activities.
Yeah, and I would say very helpfully, some of the sort of email responses I'm getting to the report and so on, creative juices are flowing. So a very well-respected scholar sent me a note in his own thought experiment about, the taking over of the presidential office, a real special operations activity that he had thought through. And I think it's important to get the thinking processes going and realizing that even the Chinese say that they have more than one option. I think on the quarantine and blockade, to bring your point and Fred's point together, so a lot of times when I see these, and we're reviewing for our next planning exercise and our next reports, all the war games that we possibly can find. Sometimes you just see these activities as, okay, they're going to do a naval blockade and it's not going to work because naval blockades don't work, right? But they're not thinking about the political effect on Taiwan. That's the point, right? So you always have to think with every activity that the Chinese might take, what's the political effect on Taiwan? So the Chinese do a naval blockade. I mean, they live like down the block from Taiwan. They can come back the next day. I mean, they can take the blockade off and tell Taiwan, okay, this round maybe you and your friends have won, but we're right here. Tomorrow we're doing shipping inspections, and so I think politics is, a lot of these kind of invasion scenarios and the conversation about invasion. Again, we're not saying there won't be an invasion. Are just abstracting out the politics. They're very non-Clausewitzian, and so naval blockades don't work. Well, I've shown to, I just think it's necessary for the debate to be elevated and say, what do you mean it doesn't? What do you mean it doesn't work? What's the political effect on Taiwan over a long period of time?
So we called this project the Alternative Strategies for Coalition Defense of Taiwan. We have a question right along those lines. What role do fellow Asian democracies like Japan and Korea play in this kind of campaign to defend Taiwan?
Well, I would say it's not just Asian democracies. Because we postulate in this campaign, but I think just as a broader matter that the essence of Chinese activities is political warfare first, with different kinetic options that would buttress political warfare. The interest of the world in Taiwan's continued existence and thriving as a liberal democracy, and in the protection of its rights and interests, with better specific definition of what those rights and interests are and what encroachments on those, I think is a very important way to undermine a political campaign that's trying to isolate Taiwan, right? So counter-isolation, and counter-isolation is just key. I mean, it's just key. And so, every country will contribute, differently to that counter-isolation approach, but it's just so important, from G7 statements that should get more specific to who engages in FONOPS to who engages in resilience training. All of that is extremely important to defeat a political warfare campaign.
Bonnie,
I
would
don't know,
you
Kim, if you want to comment on, from the Ukraine perspective, how important allies
Yeah,
and partners are.
thank you. I'm happy to take that. Look, the United States does not operate alone in the world. The United States is part of a series of coalitions, alliances, and partnerships that bring capability that really magnify and expand our intrinsic power. And so what we have seen in the war in Ukraine, of course, is how important it has been, not only for the United States to contribute to assisting Ukraine in order to protect itself, but also for other allies and partners to do the same. And what we have seen actually is a huge increase in European financial commitments and military commitments to the protection of Ukraine and to the defense of the security economic order that we enjoy. So that alliance structure is actually essential for the success of the United States, and it will, and our Asian allies, allies in Asia Pacific, are also very interested in what is happening in Ukraine. What I think we need to recognize and see is that we are going to have to depend on our allies and partners around the world, and that we are actually going to have to invest in our capabilities as alliances, as partners, and as states in order to create the secure conditions in Asia Pacific, in Europe, and elsewhere. So let's recognize what our allies and partners already do, understand how game-changing it is for our effort, and then reinforce the various bilateral and multilateral structures, alliances, and forums that actually can make it possible to respond cogently, coherently, and proactively, if not preemptively, to the threats that we are going to face.
So we're at time. I'd like to round off with just a larger observation to step back from all of this about why we think this is so important. One of the most important things that we Americans have to get straight about when we're talking about helping Taiwan defend itself, when we're talking about helping Ukraine defend itself, is that these are not acts of pure strategic altruism. This is not grand strategic philanthropy. I certainly do deeply sympathize and empathize with the plight of the Ukrainians and would desire to help them. And I certainly do want to help the free people of Taiwan retain their freedoms. But the United States has vital national interests in preventing Russian aggression from conquering a neighboring state, in preventing the People's Republic of China from seizing and suppressing and eliminating the freedoms of the people of Taiwan, and also from using Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier that would enormously complicate American efforts to defend our treaty allies against further Chinese encroachment. A big part of the problem that we have, and I think a potential vulnerability, a weakness that can be exploited in a cognitive warfare campaign, is that the more we talk about a Taiwan scenario as an isolated US must defend Taiwan scenario, the more vulnerable we are to cognitive warfare campaigns that confuse us and cause us to say, well, why exactly should, and people say this, why would you trade Los Angeles for Taipei? And so on, which is, of course, not the point. It's not the point in many directions, but it's really not the point because this is not just about defending Taipei. And it's also not just defending about an abstract rules-based international order. At the end of the day, it is about deciding whether or not we wish to live in a truly Hobbesian world that is a war of all against all, in which predators feel free to attack and devour any prey that they can or think they can. That is not a war, that is not a world that will leave America untouched. It is not a world that Americans will want to live in. And it's a world that it is a vital American interest to prevent from coming about. And I think that as the basis, as we build any strategy, and as we approach this, and as we considered what are the US interests, because that was the very first thing we did in this exercise, was actually start by, okay, what actually are America's interests here? Under all of them is that. We have to think about what kind of world we actually want to live in, not in any abstract way, but in a very concrete way. And that is something that I think is very important that we never lose sight of. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and above all, in thanking the amazing team that wrote this report. Would have written 1,000 pages if we let them, but we constrained them to this. And thank you all for coming.